Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Ray. I'm a detransition male, and today I'm going to be talking about a very famous essay in trans feminism called the Null hypothesis. So this is a pretty old essay. It was influential back when I transitioned 8 years ago. I think it was written, I don't know if there's a date here. Yeah, 2012. So it's been influential for a long time. And just kind of give you an idea of how influential. If you look up this essay on Reddit, you'll see that it is compared to the ultimate egg cracker. So this is how this poster characterized this essay. It's an egg cracker. And here's the GIF here, cracking eggs. If you don't know, an egg in the trans community is someone who does not yet know they are trans, and then upon their egg cracking, they discover that they are trans. So one of the most common questions in the trans community is, am I really transgender? And so when people search this, one of the things they come to is this website here, amitransgender.net, and the answer is yes. And one of the links to support this answer is the Null hypothesis by Natalie Reed. So it's very popular, very influential essay in trans feminism. And to kind of summarize the logic here, the question is, or the idea is, if you are asking yourself, am I transgender, then most likely you are transgender, because people who are not transgender don't ask themselves, am I transgender? So that's kind of the basic summary of the theory here. So let's get into it. So the Null hypothesis starts off talking about how when you're hanging around trans folk, you notice there are recurrent themes, motifs, common stories of denial. There's sort of a common motif of cis society invalidating, these narratives. And I think it's really interesting. One of the first things that is commented on here in terms of a method by which cis society uses to say we can't possibly really be trans is it's probably just a kink, a sex thing. So I thought this was interesting as the very first example in this long litany of examples. It's just a phase. Doesn't everybody on some level sort of want to be the opposite sex? I should just learn to live with being a feminine man. I just need to man up. Maybe I'm just a self-hating gay man. Maybe I can just cross-dress on the weekends. Just my OCD, just my depression, blah, blah, blah. But I just thought it was interesting that the very first thing that came to mind is it's probably just a kink, because if you've listened to my channel at all, you'll know that I am a fan of the theory of autogynephilia, which says that the vast majority of trans women coming into their identity as trans women are doing so because it is a quote-unquote sex thing. That doesn't mean you're not trans. It just, that is the causal origin of those feelings. It's a sex thing. Doesn't mean it's good or bad. It's just what it is as a theory. So that's sort of the first thing that jumps out to me here, is that it's kind of very telling that this is such a common thing to be concerned about. Oh, it's just a kink, just a sex thing, that it is worth mentioning. So going further into the essay, deepening this denial is the assumption that in order to accept the possibility of being trans, we have to prove that we are trans. Because what if I'm wrong? What if I make a mistake? What if I regret it? These doubts persist into the beginning of transition, and they usually don't abate until you actually start the process, in which case we should note there's also going to be considerations of the sunk cost fallacy. But yeah, some people do find relief from this stuff when they start HRT. But getting to the meat of the thing here is, she says, if proof of being trans was even really something possible beyond the simple proof of subjectively experiencing our identity and gender as such, but more importantly, we never ask ourselves for proof that we are cis. Cis is treated as the null hypothesis. It doesn't require any evidence. It's just the assumed given. All suspects are presumed cisgender until proven guilty of transsexuality in a court of painful self-exploration. But this isn't a viable, logical, skeptical way to approach the situation. In fact, it's not a case of a hypothesis being weighted against a null hypothesis, like there's a flying teapot orbiting the Earth versus there is no flying teapot orbiting the Earth. It is simply two competing hypotheses. Two hypotheses that should be held to equal standards and their likelihood weighed against one another. Well, the first thing to say here is that if you are weighing two competing hypotheses, you have to take the base rate into consideration. So, given a population being trans, well, it used to be pretty rare to be trans. So if you're just a regular person and you're asking yourself the question, am I trans? Looking at the base rate, it is more likely that you are not trans than if you are trans, because that is the base rate, just because there's way more non-trans people than there are trans people. So this right off the bat sort of strikes me as a little misleading to sort of compare these as if they're, perfectly, compatible or equally likely, but the whole theory here is that, well, if you are even asking yourself this question of, am I trans, then that is evidence that you are trans, because what is the likelihood that you are a cis person asking yourself the question, am I trans, versus what is the likelihood of you being a trans person who is asking yourself the questions, am I trans? And the idea is that if you're asking yourself, am I trans, then, you're more likely than not to be trans. So let's get into it here. This is an interesting paragraph. When the question is reframed as such, suddenly those self-denials, those ridiculous, painful, self-destructive demands we place on ourselves to come up with proof of being trans suddenly start to look a whole lot less valid and rational when we replace the question, am I sure I'm trans, with the question, based on the evidence that is available and what my thoughts, behaviors, and past and feelings suggest, what is more likely, that I am trans or that I am cis? What was once an impossible, unresolvable question is replaced by one that's answer is painfully obvious. Cis people may wonder about being the opposite sex, but they don't obsessively dream of it. Cis people don't constantly go over the question of transition again and again throughout our lives. Cis people don't find themselves in this kind of crisis. Cis people don't secretly spend every birthday wish on wanting to wake up magically transformed into the opposite sex, nor do they spend years developing increasingly precise variations of how they'd like this wish to be fulfilled. Cis people don't spend all-nighters on the internet secretly researching transition and secretly looking at who transitioned at what age, how much money they had, how much their features resembled their own, and try to figure out what their own results would be. Cis people don't get enormously excited when really, really terrible movies that just happen to include gender-bending themes like Switch or Dr. Jekyll and Mrs. Hyde randomly pop up on late-night TV. So let's unpack this a little bit. So going back to the, it's just a kink, well, on the theory of autogynephilia, you could very much be a cis person and have all these thoughts. It's just that these thoughts would be caused by autogynephilia, which is a sexual attraction to being the opposite sex. So right off the bat, we see that this theory doesn't get off the water because one can have autogynephilia and never go on to adopt a trans identity. So and if you don't have a trans identity, then on the common definition, you are cis. So right away, we see that you can be cis and have all these thoughts, all these obsessions with being the opposite sex. It's just that your obsession with being the opposite sex is motivated by sexuality. Now, of course, there are many people with autogynephilia who do go on to adopt a trans identity and transition, go on hormones, get surgeries, and it's according to the research, it is the most common pathway in the Western world for trans women to develop feelings of gender dysphoria. So this is why I don't think the cis-trans distinction here is all that helpful, because if you reframe this in terms of, males experiencing these thoughts, the question is it normal for males to have these thoughts about being obsessed with turning into the opposite sex? Well, depending on your definition of normal, I mean, it's not that uncommon. People estimate that autogynephilia makes up like 3 to 5% of the male population. So, and like I said, like not everyone who has these thoughts goes on to adopt a trans identity and transition. So now we have 3 competing hypotheses. 1 is that you're cisgender, 1 is that you're trans, and 3, you have autogynephilia, which may or may not be compatible with the trans identity, depending on how you want to act upon those feelings. And I'm not saying it's like wrong to act upon those feelings in transition if you do have autogynephilia. In fact, the original research on autogynephilia was done on transsexual women who were seeking out medical care, surgeries and whatnot. So Ray Blanchard, the popularizer of the theory, he never really said that autogynephilia was like a contraindication to being trans or, transitioning and getting all these medical interventions and stuff. But I just wanted to bring this up because the whole, like, am I trans or am I cis? Like, those are not the only options. So one might recognize that you have all these like obsessive desires, but one realize that, hey, it is just a sex thing. And, maybe because you now realize that that is the true source of these underlying desires, you now have an informed knowledge about, what's going on with you psychologically. So now you have a choice. Do I want to deal with these desires by transitioning, or do I want to deal with them by trying to integrate them into one's life while still maintaining, a male identity? And, depending on the severity and intensity of these desires, for some people, transition is really like the only way that they can see themselves being happy with these desires. But I just wanted to like question the framing here, because the idea that, oh, well, regular males never have these thoughts, or non-trans people never have these thoughts, it's just not true, because there are definitely people who don't have a trans identity who have these, thought patterns. So right off the bat, like we can see that this like idea that there's only 2 competing hypotheses, it's just not accurate. There's more going on here than just like, oh, am I trans or am I cis? So going down further, one thing I think is interesting and very telling about the trans discourse, or the mainstream trans ideology, whatever you want to call it, is that you can't falsify something as wholly subjectively defined as a gender identity anyway, and if you can't falsify a claim, it's a bit silly to demand it to be proven. And I just think this is a really interesting thing to say, because it kind of highlights the difficulties of using gender identity as a legal basis for defining, one's, legal status or anything like this, or because if you can't prove that you have a gender identity, like, is this really something we want to use as a basis for legal standing in society? We just have to like trust what people say. Like, people say, oh yeah, I have this gender identity. Okay. Like, there's no way to verify that. There's no way to prove it. So this is someone deep into gender theory, trans theory, and they're acknowledging that like the concept of gender identity is fully subjective, fully amorphous, and fully incapable of meeting demands of empirical proof. So, if you were, trying to establish one's legal rights, or, one's right to access certain privileges, then, if you're using gender identity, it seems a little, difficult to use that as a legal basis. So moving on, she writes that this treatment of cisgenderism is so thoroughly unmarked, so deeply embedded as the assumed default, the privileged normal that is conceptually rendered the null hypothesis, the case that must only be disproven and never ever is itself held as something that needs to be questioned, proven, something that one ought to be sure of, that it ends up rendering cisnormativity a force so powerfully ingrained in our culture that it's almost wholly inextricable. So, yeah, and she goes on, like, this whole idea that your subjective identity can't be legitimate unless you're somehow able to back it up with objective evidence is a pretty awful situation to be put in, especially when you're inflicting it on yourself, given how any proof of being trans is entirely dependent on subjective experience. Well, this is exactly, what fuels people's problems with the whole concept of gender identity. Because let's say hypothetically, you're a trans woman, and your dream in life is to be a female prison guard. You've always wanted to be a female prison guard. But let's say also that you are 6'5", 300 pounds, and you're pre-transition, so you haven't started hormones, you haven't shaved your beard, you haven't done anything. You just look like a regular male. No one would ever know that you're trans, because there was what they're saying, like, trans is a subjective thing. You can't prove it. There's no external proof that one is trans. It's just an internal subjective feeling that is totally subjective, and it's impossible to provide objective proof of this. So if we were to grant that the concept of sex is replaceable by this subjective gender identity, such that all the rights and entailments that come along with the legal sex of being female is strictly determined based on the declaration that one has a certain subjective inner gender identity, then this, trans woman would have a legal basis for applying to the job of a female prison guard, which normally that position is reserved for females, because if you're a female prison guard, you're going to be subjecting other females, cis women, to strip searches. And, it just seems like the right thing to do to not let, females become strip searched by 6'5" males with beards. And it doesn't really matter if you have an inner subjective identity of being a trans woman, because it's about, how much you pass. And even if you do pass, there's still a question of, like, how come this inner gender identity supplants the, like, normal, like, social rules here in regards to, like, well, you shouldn't let a male, strip search a female, particularly in these kind of intimate settings. So it kind of, and I use that example instead of, like, the typical, like, bathroom example, just because it's such a clear case, and it's possibly an edge case. But, when you're doing philosophy, when you're analyzing, like, the legitimacy of a concept, you should be using edge cases because they test the limits of an idea. So if it were a valid thing to replace the concept of sex with the concept of the subjective gender identity, such that what it means to be a female is to have a subjective gender identity, then it would provide an answer to this edge case. But since all our intuition says that this edge case, it would not be appropriate to replace the concept of sex in the female bursting card example, then we can sort of tell that this concept of gender identity is not a fully practical way to, demarcate legal entailments to certain privileges. And she goes on to say that, nobody fits the true transsexual narrative perfectly. And this is very telling. Where does she say it? She says, what if you are not really this gender? Well, it doesn't really matter, because go ahead and give yourself permission to be something you're not, proof or no proof, if that's what's going to give you a chance at some semblance of happiness, comfort, then no one gets to judge your identity and its sincerity and legitimacy but you. And so she's saying, like, here we go. And maybe philosophically speaking, a given trans woman might on some level, quote unquote, really be a dude. But even if that is true of yourself, it doesn't really matter, because it's all about this subjective gender identity. So if you think you're trans, then you are trans. This is why the answer to this, am I transgender, is yes. And on every Reddit thread that gets posted about, like, am I trans, like, this is the answer, because it's like, if you think you're trans, you're trans. That's all it takes, because it's an inner subjective feeling. It doesn't require proof. But this idea that, like, that no one gets to judge your identity and sincerity and legitimacy but you. You can have permission to be something you're not. But as we can see in the female prison card example, we do get to judge your identity. We get to judge your identity and deem that it is not sufficient to supplant the legal protections surrounding sex. It's just not how it works. Because if you are 6'5", 300 pounds, look male, have a beard, and maybe you've gone on HRT a little bit or whatever, but the whole trans movement is, when you really get into radical trans feminism, they'll say that, well, it's cis sexist, it's cis normative to expect that trans women have to pass as cis female to be real in their gender, because the realness of the gender is based on the inner subjectivity of the gender identity. So this 6'5", 300-pound trans woman, even though she doesn't pass at all, not even close, she's still a, quote, real instantiation of her gender, because she's something that she's not. There's no proof of it, but you just have to accept it, and no one can judge it. There's no rational or empirical basis to, question the legitimacy of that identity, because the legitimacy is entirely defined based on the subjectivity. But, and I just want to say here that, if that identity gives you happiness and comfort, great. I want people to be happy and comfortable, and I'm not against transition. I'm not against people as adults who are fully informed, fully consenting, fully aware of all the risk, and who have done the research, talked to the doctors, gone through, a rigorous psychological assessment that they truly are capable of giving informed consent. I do believe that there should be some gatekeeping. And if you do have an informed consent model, you better well be sure that like you should be truly informed and not just like partially informed, or informed but like not really fully cognizant of the actual repercussions and risk. But if you satisfy all those conditions as an adult, like, yeah, I have no problem with like people transitioning, or it does make people happy, but like your own personal happiness does not like grant you legal status. Like, it doesn't change your, it doesn't give you the legal right to be a female prison guard. And I'm just going to stick with that example just because it's such a clear case. And maybe there's some more nuances to discuss, like bathrooms or something like this, where maybe it's not as personally invasive because you're just going into use the stall to but yeah, it sort of speaks to the fact that like even if you make this decision out of like happiness and comfort, like we do get to judge your identity, and we get to judge whether your identity has a legit basis for legal rights. We ought to be able to take into account other factors, like how much you pass, like whether you are going to unsettle, females in a particular space. And, you shouldn't be upset that society, might judge you for your identity just because, I don't think like merely having an inner subjective sense, like, is a fully legitimate basis for, upending society to accommodate you. Like, yeah, we should accommodate you insofar as like literally everyone in this country has a constitutional right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But that only goes so far. Like you can pursue your own happiness, but not at the expense of like other people. So that's just what I wanted to say there. Yeah, I just thought this was an interesting like essay. Like, obviously it's been incredibly influential in the trans community. Like I read this when I transitioned. I think every trans woman reads this as some. It's the famous egg cracking, essay, and it's just very, very influential. But as you can see, that there's some underlying tensions inherent to this essay, but it kind of highlight in a perfect way the sort of like deep subjectivity of the transgender movement, because it sort of points out that like it's not about proof, it's not about like whether I satisfy the DSM criteria, or am I like a true transsexual or true trans, all this stuff. Like, if you really get into like radical trans theory, radical trans feminism, like there's no proof, there's no empiricism, there's no objectivity. It's just feelings all the way down. It's just pure subjectivity. And maybe that is true in some phenomenological sense. And but I think we should, one, be aware of actual causal psychological phenomenon such as autogynephilia, which provide an alternative model as to the origins of these feelings, because like according to the theory of autogynephilia, these feelings result, or sometimes they can result from what's called an erotic target inversion. So yeah, that's just an interesting thing. And I feel like if we're going to be informed, and we're going to go to the doctor and be like, hey, give me these medications, give me this surgery that is irreversible, we ought to be fully informed of like what's causing all this. Because if we're going to like do our competing hypotheses, we ought to understand what is the causal basis for the phenomenon that we're using these competing hypotheses to explain? We should understand the psychology here, and sort of denying it is not helpful. And it's obviously like on top of mind because it's like the first thing. Like this is a very common question of like, oh, is it just a kink? Well, the reason why so many people are like, is it just a kink? Maybe it's because it is a kink, but like I said, like it being a kink doesn't make it not trans, because the theory itself was never designed to say like, oh, if you have this kink, you're not trans. It just means like, hey, this is where it's all coming from. So it's not like judgmental. It's just a scientific model of like where this all comes from. And you still ought to, make an informed decision about like how you want to treat that. And, Ray Blanchard, as a theorist, like he did think that transition could be a useful treatment for people, who do have autogynephilia. But yeah, so those are my thoughts on this essay. Thanks for watching. Take care.